Ready.
Hi, Ernie.
Hello.
Good evening.
Harold,
Hi, Mario.
where are you, in the South Pole?
In the desert, outside. It's
I
nice.
know. Oh, outside. Oh.
I don't have any pants on. I'm not wearing pants. So that's why I have a jacket.
That's because you
Oh,
got your feet in the
okay.
pool, in the jacuzzi.
Okay, so we're on,
Ernie, are you back home?
we came back yesterday.
Okay, where we hold.
143.
143 exactly. Tzurba M'Rabanan on volume 6, Yoredeya. We're finishing up Hilchos Chinuch Ktanim. Another question discussed by the poskim in connection with children is whether they have to do tshuva for sins committed while they were minors. According to the Ramah, who cites the Trumas Hadesh and who was a Rishon, the child is not technically obligated to do so after Bas or Bar Mitzvah, since at the time of the sin, he or she was not yet responsible for their actions. Nevertheless, it is recommended to do something as a form of tshuva. Says the Ramah, the Kotan Shehika Aviv, let's say the child remembers that he had hit his father, or Avar Shar Averos Bekatnuso, or committed other Averos. Aval Bishen Tzorach Tshuva Kishi, there's no Chiyuv Tshuva. Mikol Makom Tov Lo Sheikabel Alatzmo Eze Davar LeTshuva LeChapara. The child should be taught, once he reaches Bar Mitzvah, he should accept something upon himself as a tshuva of a kapara. So that's the Ramah. The Bach, right? Remember, the Bach is a commentator on the tour. He's a little bit before the Ramah, but after Rav Yosef Karo. The Bach clarifies that this principle applies to mitzvos bein adam lechavero. Consequently, a child who damaged property belonging to another is not required to pay compensation for damages, and neither are the parents on behalf of the child, but it's appropriate to do something to compensate for the damage. Right, says the Bach, klala ole, that kotten shagonov hizik, let's say a child stole something or damaged, potter milishalem kishigdil, meikar adin is potter. Chazal did not create a takana that he has to make payment afterwards. He also doesn't have any punishment if he violated Shabbos or some other avera. Somehow doing a bad thing causes harm to a person's nefesh. The Aval be the Koden Shovar Avera below das, he lo tov la nefesh. Ki imshich aliyat tuma mitzarara. It sort of brought tuma to the nefesh. Al kein tov lo kishiyag lashuv b'tshuva me'atzmo al kol mashovar. It's a good thing for him to think about what he did and maybe do some tshuva. The Mishnah Brura says, "Koden shagana v'shehizik, roy lebezin lakoso shelo yargil bo." So bezin should strike a koden as a chinuch, so that he doesn't become used to doing these kind of things. Or let's say he wounded another person or embarrassed another person. Bezdin mitzuin la frisha shelo yeret hakol yado. Bezdin should separate him from these actions. Aval ein tzarich l'shalem imena gneva be'en. Right? If there's gneva is not be'en, he doesn't have to pay. V'chol ze midina. Aval ifnim mishras adin, going beyond the letter of the law, bein shechavel bo begufo shehizik lo b'mano tzarich l'shalem lo. So the Mishnah Berurah is quite quite stern regarding, what children should do when they're magdil, thinking about averes that they did when they were younger. What about children fasting on fast days?
Notice they don't tell the parents to do the reprimanding. The Bezin does it. They really should say that they should reprimand the parents to tell the child. Whether they leave it up to Bezin to do it, they
I
should
think
tell
this
the
is the
parents.
case where it's done in front of Bezdin.
Physical reprimand.
Yeah, if Bezdin sees it, then they should do something. Now, another area of halacha where the status of chinuch for children is relevant is the issue of the communal fast days. Although in theory, the mitzvah of chinuch should dictate that older children should fast on these days, Chazal did not institute a mitzvah for fasting in such cases, even on Yom Kippur. Nevertheless, Chazal did institute a practice of children above certain ages fasting for a limited period of time on Yom Kippur, which is clear from the Mishnah and Gemara in Yom 82. We discussed this in volume 3 in the Shiur on laws of Yom Kippur. In today's section, we will focus the question on whether a similar practice of fasting for part of the day is required, recommended, or even permitted with regard to the other fast days, such as Tisha B'Av, Asar B'Teves, Shivasar B'Tammuz, Tzom Gedalia. Right? Some have the custom of having children who have reached the age of chinuch fast, based on the following passage in Masechta Sofrim. When they were 11, and Ben Shtemasrei Lahashlim, and at the age of 12, they would complete a fast. They would bring the child on the fast day to the elders, so that the elders would bench him and to be mechazek him and to daven for him. They wouldn't leave their young children at home. They would bring them to shul, so they would see what's going on. Rav Menachem Azariah de Fano, known as the Ramomi Fano, writes that one should not encourage them to complete the fast, since it may be dangerous for them. The Mirami Fano was a Rishon. Well, he's actually in the generation of the Ramah, a little bit after the close of the Rishonim period. Hachinuch letinokas pedalad somos, im l'shaos livriim bilvad. You can allow healthy children to fast a few hours. Minig yofahu. V'chein b'miut tanug. They should reduce how much they play. The Ramami Fano says it's not wise to allow children to fast because of sakana. He says there's no difference between Tisha B'Av and the other fasts. The Kaimalon Krabon and Rav Yehuda, the Savri ain't chinuch l'katan b'drabanan. That there is no din chinuch for a cotton in rabbinic law. And since the other fasts are rabbinic, there's no din of chinuch. Lefichach lo amrinon b'kriyas hamegillah, the osi drabanan mafik drabanan. We don't say let the rabbinic law of chinuch come to be motes, to teach them about kriyas megillah, which is completely drabanan. Kedamrin b'birchas hamazon, which is b'daraisa v'kol shekein hacha, d'minadin afilu g'dolim b'shar tzomois. The Ramami Fano points out that even for adults, these fasts, if they wanted to fast, rotzu misanim, lo rotzu ein misanim. Now, that's what the Gemara says. Now, the later halacha said that we accepted upon ourselves to fast. But in the Divrei Chazal, even adults, im lo rotzu ein misanim. Right? V'afal gav dikvar rotzu. V'kilu navustenu l'choy v'aleim v'aleinu. Dumi de me beishan beberk pakum shenagu. The lohavi ozli mitzur l'tzidim v'malei shabta. There was a prohibition to travel from Tyre to Sidon Erev Shabbos. V'osru l'vanayu Rav Yochanan gav the d'chich l'shmaitza. And Rabbi Yochanan continued to forbid the children from doing this, even though it was a difficult gzeira to do. So there were things that the people accepted, but mishena misana poretz geder, and someone who doesn't fast today, after we accepted to fast, you are a poretz geder. It's like you break down a fence. We call makom leka chiyuva l'gardiki klal. There's no chiyuv for children. Even close to puberty. And vilavdim istafina amina mitzvah baba verehi. He said, if I wasn't afraid of my colleagues, I would say that allowing a child to fast is mitzvah hababa vera. It's really an avera that they're doing. And there's a nice biography of the Ramon Mifana. The Chai Adam takes a different approach, that children have no obligation to fast on the minor fast days, to the chinuch, even for a few hours. If something isn't intrinsically osir, but it's osir because of a day, shayom gorim, ein bo mitzvahs chinuch. There's no chinuch. Lefichach, mutar litein letinuk lechol kodem kiddush. For example, we don't eat on Shabbos before kiddush. But you don't have to be machanech a child to do that. Avagav l'chayiv l'chancho b'kiddush. Right? You're chayiv to teach him kiddush. Kiddush is a deraisa. All deraisas you have to be machanech them in. But this rabbinic din that you're not supposed to eat before kiddush, that you don't have to teach them. L'chein ein tzarich l'chancham lisanis b'sanis tzibur. Afilu b'tishbav, says the Chai Adam. So there's no special inyan of chinuch for children for these fasts. As mentioned, I'll agree that there's no actual obligation for children to fast during the minor fast days. Nevertheless, the Ramon Mifano writes that one should reduce the amount of food one gives to children to the basic minimum. Even if they're not going to fast, you give them enough to eat to make them, not hungry. They will participate in the morning. And noticing that they're being fed differently on these fast days is enough of a chinuch regarding the chinuch of Yom Tzom. The Mogen Avram, right, one of the major commentators on the Shulchan Aruch, quotes the Ramon Mifano, but limits it to children who are old enough to be misabel. Because of Nachum Azariah, Tani machinosam lechem umayim lisabel matzibur ad kam l'shono v'nirali davka cotton sheyesh odas lisabel. If you have a cotton who understands the concept of mourning, so fine, you can give him less to eat. But if the child has no concept, then you can feed him in a normal way. The Mishnah Berurah echoes this ruling that it is appropriate to train one's children not to eat more than necessary, though he stresses that it's not a chiyuv. Says the Mishnah Berurah, v'chein haktanim sheyesh lam das lisabel. They know what it means to mourn. You're not mechuyev to train them. Afilu ben yuz ben shan, even if they're 12. Afilu b'taynis shos, you don't have to teach them to fast a few hours. You teach them to just eat whatever they need. Lechem umayim, oshar Michael pashut lefiatinuk. The Kaf HaChaim writes that in his opinion, this is not the prevalent custom. Rather, he states that parents give their children regular meals, but they should hold candies and other treats. Miu b'sefer halacha brura kosav lahasig adi Rab Menachem Azariah and his karm the Ramon Mifano because of kibbadu b'shei noagim kin. He says that's not our custom to reduce how much they eat. They can eat normal. Rav Ovadia Yosef in Chazon Ovadia writes that children do not fast even for a few hours until they become bar or bas mitzvah. Haktanim sheim begil pachos mi bar mitzvah, einam esanim b'tzom es elo. Afilu Tani shows, even hours. V'rak shigula mitzvahs, only until they're bar mitzvah or bas mitzvah. Hatinik ben yud gimel shana b'yom echad, v'atinokes bad yud b'shana b'yom echad. Misad. V'davka b'yom ha-kippurim, shu mitzvah min ha-Torah, mitzvah l'chancham. That's where we had those other halachas. We start having them fast for a few hours, depending on their age. Aval tanios elu, but all the rabbinic fasts, including Tisha B'Av, she'enam el zecher l'churban, v'anu metzapim l'binyan beis hamikdash me'er yameinu, ein makam l'chancham. And there's a summary of the laws of chinuch that you can review for Chazar. Okay, we're going to go to page 163, the laws of Hafrashat Challah.
Important for us.
Page 163.
Okay.
This is the first of 3 shiurim that's going to discuss the halachos relating to grain and dough used for bread, specifically the laws of separating challah and the laws of chadash. The mitzvah of hafrashas challah, separating a portion of dough to give to the kohen before baking, is in principle a Torah chiyuv. And we have it in Parshas Korach. Daber bnei Yisrael, v'yamarta lehem b'voachem el haaretz, asher ani mevi eschem shama, v'ayabach lechem milechem haaretz, tarimu truma la'Hashem. It's referring to challah. Reishis arisoseichem challah tarimu truma, kisrumas goren kein tarimu oso. Reishis arisoseichem titnu la'Hashem truma l'doreseichem. So all of these psukim relate to challah. The Sefer HaChinuch offers 2 different reasons for the mitzvah of hafrashas challah. Misharshei mitzvah. What's the reason for the mitzvah? Lefi shechayusa shalada b'bezonos, v'rova olam yichyu b'lechem. Grain is the staple of life. Ratza makom l'zachuseinu b'mitzvah tmidus b'lachmeinu. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to give us the zchus, sort of a constant mitzvah connected to our bread. By performing a mitzvah in the making of the bread, so there'll be a special bracha in the bread. And since we eat bread every day, it's a good thing for us. And our nefesh gets the zchus. So since there's a mitzvah and a bracha involved, it's sort of spiritual sustenance for our neshama, in the same way that the grain is physical sustenance for our cells. Gam laman yichyu bo mishor se Hashem. And we're living, the fact that we're eating bread allows us to live, and we are those who serve God. Haoskin tamid b'avodato. V'hem kohanim. Right? And the people who serve God all the time, the Kohanim, they're going to be the recipient of the challah because we give the challah to them. And we don't want them to have to work hard. When we give them truma from grain, well, they have a lot of work to do. They've got to grind it, turn it into flour. Here, when you give them some of the dough, it's already ready-made. It's easy for the Kohen to, make it into bread. So the Sefer HaChinuch's first reason that Hashem wished to give us a privilege of doing a mitzvah every time we prepare bread for eating, which is otherwise becomes a regular mundane activity. It becomes similar to the idea of reciting a bracha when we eat something. When we eat something, we make a bracha, so there's a mitzvah already involved. Second reason focuses on the giving of the challah to the Kohanim, which is in a manner of supporting them, so they can concentrate on their mission of teaching the rest of the people what Kohanim teach, Torah. Okay, well, what about the obligation of hafrashas challah nowadays and in Chutz La'aretz? According to most poskim, the mitzvah of challah today is only rabbinic, even in Eretz Yisrael. Because the Gemara Nida derives from the psukim above that the biblical mitzvah applies only when the majority of Jews live in Israel, which is not currently the case, though it may be so in the not too distant future. So
Very close.
this is one of the examples where normative halacha may change in the next few years based on the population demographics between Eretz Yisrael and the rest of the world. At that time, according to these poskim, the mitzvah of Afrashas Challah in Eretz Yisrael will become Doraisa, but it is not at this time. It's only rabbinic.
And they don't count religious or not religious, right? These poskim.
You're talking about when we add up the Jewish people?
I don't know. Who are the poskim? Who would determine that? Someone in Eretz Yisrael or someone in America? Obviously in Eretz Yisrael, because it has to be Eretz Yisrael.
Right?
So who are the poskim?
Well, that's going to
They
be a very good question. If we don't count, non-religious Jews, in a minyan, you can't count them. We learned all those halachas. When they touch wine, it's considered yayin nesech.
Right, okay.
All of
Continues.
those things that we learned. It could be that when we count Klal Yisrael, they may exclude that, and then it'll be a long time before that happens. I don't think that that's the normative law. I think the normative laws, we don't look at that. I think we still count all Jews, because throughout Klal Yisrael, when we had a census, David HaMelech, wasn't it everybody were tzaddikim? So again, I'm sure that will come up when this becomes an issue.
Ernie, nowadays, you don't have Kohanim who you have to support, who teach Torah. I mean, so what happens? We're just disposing of that.
Says who?
Yeah, but remember, the challah has to be disposed of. We burn it because we don't give it to the Kohanim. But you can't eat it because the challah is like tevel. And we're going to see midoraisa, the dough that you don't give the challah from is also like tevel. So you need to give the challah to be matir, the remaining dough, even if you don't have a coin to give it to, Bernie.
You're falling asleep, Harold. It's not for you.
Again? What was that? I didn't catch that. What was that?
No. It's good.
Harold's too warmly dressed. He's falling asleep.
No, so right now we're saying that certainly in Chutz La'aretz it's rabbinic, and even Bizman Hazeh in Eretz Yisrael, because the population is such that there's not the majority of Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, it's also rabbinic. Masechta Nida, afilu man damer truma Bizman Hazeh daraisa. So even according to those opinions, who hold that truma today is daraisa challah d'Rabbanan, but challah is a different din. The Tanya, if you're talking about when you come into the land, maybe when Yoshua sent the Meraglim to Rachav Azona, maybe that means b'voachem. Talmud lomer b'voachem bebias kulchem amarti. V'lo bevias miktaschem. V'cheskinu Ezra lo kulu solik. And in fact, when Ezra came back, only 29,000, he brought only 29,000 Jews. The vast majority of the Jewish people remained in Bavel. So the Gemara is clearly saying in the time, even at the time of the Gemara, that challah was rabbinic. The Rambam codified that as halacha, that challah no longer applies midoraisa even in Israel. Ein chayavin b'challah min haTorah ela be'eretz Yisrael bilvad. Shenemar vayabach lechem milechem haaretz. It is a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz. So there are times where the mitzvah of challah will be doraisa, but that's ubizman shekol Yisrael sham. Shenemar b'voachem bias kulchem v'lo bias mitzaschem. Lefichach challah bizman hazeh afilu b'mei Ezra be'eretz Yisrael ein ela midivreim k'mo shebiarnu b'truma. We're going to learn of the din of truma. That we'll get to. But right now, we're learning challah. Challah is rabbinic. Does the mitzvah of Afrashas Challah apply at all outside of Israel? Technically, since it's an agricultural mitzvah, it should be one of the mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz, the mitzvahs depend upon the land of Israel, which do not apply in the diaspora as well. Just like separating trumas and maasros need not be taken from produce grown in the diaspora. However, Gemara in Brachos indicates that Afrashos Challah has always applied on a d'Rabbanan level in the diaspora, even in earlier times, when it was d'oraisa in Israel. And the Rambam codifies this as the halacha, which is 2 halachas after the one we quoted previously, that Challah applies midoraisa in Israel alone, while in Chutz La'aretz, it applies midrabanan. Why? So that the laws of Challah will not be forgotten. Rambam, that's in Hilchos Bikurim.
What about a bracha, Chutz La'aretz? When we make a freshest challah, we don't make a bracha because Rabbanan. So we don't make a bracha. We shouldn't make a bracha. Only in Eretz Yisrael probably they make a bracha on a freshest challah.
We will get there.
Okay.
So mafrishin challah b'chutz la'aretz medivrei sofrim, they shlo tishtachach Torah challah miYisrael. That's what the Rambam says. Sefer HaChinuch echoes the position of the Rambam and adds that because the purpose of Afrashas Challah in Chutz La'aretz is only to ensure that the mitzvah is not forgotten, it is customary to separate a smaller amount than is required. Medivrei sofrim la'afrish challah b'chutz la'aretz kedei shelo tishtachach Torah challah miYisrael u'mipnei she'ein hachiyuv ba elo shelo tishtachach miYisrael, because the obligation is really only that we shouldn't forget. Nagul hakil ba. There's certain leniencies. So, for example, the inyan she'ein mafrishin mi'isa gdola ela kazayis. That let's say you have a very large amount of dough, you only have to separate a kazayis. You throw it in the fire. It's not eaten by any Kohen. By the way, it should be noted that today the same is done with the challah in Israel as well, since the obligation in Israel nowadays is also only rabbinic in nature. The practical aspects of how much dough to separate and what is done with it will be discussed in the later shiurim that we're going to have on challah. Another practical difference between challah in Eretz Yisrael and in the diaspora is that in the diaspora, one may separate challah after consuming the food, which is not allowed in Eretz Yisrael.
How do you do that?
Let's see. The reason is that baked goods from which challah has not been taken are considered like tevel, untied produce, and are forbidden to be eaten from in Eretz Yisrael. In Chutz La'aretz, such produce does not have the status of tevel, and it is permitted to bake the dough first and eat it, and then separate challah, provided one does not forget. So, because the whole purpose in Chutz La'aretz is shelo tishtakach, so if you take a piece of challah, even after you ate it and burn it, you've separated challah. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, even though it's on a rabbinic level, the dough is tevel until you take the challah away. So you wouldn't be able to eat the bread after you baked it if you hadn't taken challah from it. That's not the case in Chutz La'aretz. This halacha is mentioned by Shmuel in the Gemara in Bechoros with regard to truma. The same applies to challah as well, which generally has the same halachic status as truma because that's also given to the kohen. All the dinim of truma applies to challah. A zar, a non-Yisrael cannot eat truma. Same thing, we can't eat challah. Again, the challah that we give in Chutz La'aretz is not real challah. V'amar Shmuel, truma Chutz La'aretz ochel v'holech v'achar kach mafrish. So we're going to see produce grown outside of Eretz Yisrael. There's a rabbinic mitzvah to separate truma and meiser from produce grown in regions surrounding Eretz Yisrael, such as Egypt, Syria, and the like. So there in truma that doesn't need to be separated before one eats it. You may eat it and then afterwards separate the truma. So they extrapolate this din to challah as well in Chutz La'aretz, and even in in America certainly. And the Shulchan Aruch codifies this ruling in Yoredeya, Shin Chav Gimel, V'imrotza lechol tchila, v'achar kach yafish achala. If you want to eat it and then only later be mafresh, b'chutz la'aretz mutter. Mipnei she'en ikara el midivreim. Whole thing is only rabbinic. Aval chalas Eretz Yisrael lo yochel ad sheyafrish. The challah, you can't eat the bread in Eretz Yisrael until you've actually separated it. The reason for the difference, as alluded to by the Shulchan Aruch, is that although both are obligated only midrabanan nowadays, the obligation will eventually become deraisa again in Eretz Yisrael. Like we said, maybe in a few years. So we have to know exactly how to do it properly in Eretz Yisrael, because soon it's going to be midaraisa. While in Chutz La'aretz, it's only performed to ensure that the mitzvah is not forgotten. Based on this, a very important practical difference arises between the halacha for the two locations. In the Golah, if one forgot to separate challah from dough to be used for challah or other baked goods on Friday afternoon and Shabbat has already begun, it's permitted to eat the challah on Shabbos. You leave over a small amount with which to perform afrashos challah after Shabbos. In contrast, in Eretz Yisrael, if one forgot to separate challah before Shabbos, the challah is forbidden to be eaten on Shabbos. And this point is noted by the Mishnah Berurah in Hilchos Shabbos. Shrei chalas chutz la'aretz yachol le'echol b'lo afrashos challah u'l'shayir ma'ad ad achar Shabbos u'la'afresh and separate from what is left.
Do they give a hechsher on a bread from a goy? Do you have to take challah from a goy break that has a hechsher on it?
Because it says ariso, right? Your dough. So you're talking about pas palter based bread baked by let's say old country bread. I don't know that country is not. I don't know that it could be that if it's turned on by a Jew, it's pas Yisrael.
There's OU bread in Safeway, by the way. There is OU bread or chafkei bread. But the question, you have to take challah from that?
We're gonna learn that. We're gonna. That's all of this. We're gonna have 3 shiurim on challah, but we're doing it step by step. So although hafrashos challah nowadays is only rabbinic in nature in all locations, it has nevertheless helped to create a very significant widespread minhag. Many women bake special challah on Friday for Shabbos in order to perform the mitzvah of hafrashos challah. And perhaps for this reason, the bread is called challah. I mean, challah bread could have been called bread. I mean, so it could be the reason we call challah challah is because a custom developed for Jewish women to bake challah for Shabbos and to be mafresh challah, so they have a special mitzvah going into Shabbos. So therefore, they called that bread challah. But that's not the challah. The challah is the dough that's removed from the dough and thrown into the fire, given to the kohen. That's the hafrashas challah. The remaining bread could have been called anything. It could be that they started calling it challah because of this minhag to separate challah while baking this special Shabbos bread.
Now, Ernie,
Yes?
the bread you buy in Israel, it already has challah separated, right?
We're gonna
Most of the time.
so Mario, if you buy bread from a kosher bakery, they're going to separate challah when they bake the bread.
Yeah.
But we're talking about women in private homes.
Oh,
having
yeah,
a-
I understand that. Yeah, I understand. But if you buy in Israel, I mean, it's always been separated, right?
Yeah, but
If
it's
you
the same
buy
way-
it.
Of course. It's
Okay.
bakers.
So you don't have to leave a piece. You just
No, because there they do it from the dough. What we learned tonight is that let's say you find out for whatever reason that the bread you're eating,
was not separated.
challah had not been taken from it. I'm not sure why that would have happened if you bought it from a kosher bakery, but let's say word went out that on such and such day that the batch that was baked, for whatever reason, the challah wasn't taken. So in Chutz La'aretz, you can still eat the bread. Let's say you found out about it Friday afternoon, or very late into Shabbos, and you have it for Shabbos. You're allowed to eat the bread, save a piece later, and that's even different because normally challah is separated in the dough stage. But we've learned tonight that you can leave over a piece
Yeah,
and treat it as
okay.
after Shabbos. Absolutely.
Mhm.
But yes, the kosher bakers give it, will be mafresh, and even in Chutz La'aretz. But we've learned that there's a big nafkamina. It's only rabbinic. It's rabbinic in both places, but the severity is different. In Eretz Yisrael, if the
They're not allowed.
if the bakers had not been mafreshed it, you would not be able to eat that bread. That's not the case in Chutz La'aretz,
Okay.
right?
Mhm. Thanks.
Right. Okay, that's important. So according to Ramah, this is included in the midst of Koved Shabbos, right? You have Oineg Shabbos and Koved Shabbos. They're very, part of Koved Shabbos is taking a bath before Shabbos, having special clothes for Shabbos. And then there's certain things that are as part of Oineg Shabbos. For example, Hadlokas Neiros. So you have light. Sometimes they fall under Koved, sometimes they fall under Oineg. The special dishes, kugel or chulent, special Shabbos food falls under Oineg Shabbos. So the Ramah tells us that baking bread in honor of Shabbos, you fulfill the mitzvah of Koved Shabbos. Noyagin lolush kedei shir challah b'bayis. There's a minig that
Who's fulfilled it? If a woman has baked it, then
yeah,
she has fulfilled the mitzvah or what?
yeah, the mitzvah of Koved Shabbos has been fulfilled.
But not by the man.
I guess
Unless you want to go to Tzvika Shir about Ishto Kegufo and
no,
say
but
that she does it for the man?
Sydney, it's similar to Hadlokas Neiros.
Right,
She
right.
does it, but she does it. So the question is Koved Shabbos a din in the bias, or is it
That's the question, right?
Choivas Gavra?
Right.
And so therefore, when you as a man are sitting in a home where candles have been lit, so you participated in the Koved Shabbos, your house is participating in the Koved Shabbos. Could be that the woman is the one who actually did it.
That's what you're saying, but we don't know that for sure. That's what you're saying, but we're not don't know that for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Enochanami, I'm clearing through
Right,
what
right.
clearly a mitzvah of Koved Shabbos was done.
Right.
Each one of us, there's you have to wash yourself. Some mitzvahs of Koved Shabbos, somebody can't do for you,
True.
like washing, like wearing a special clothing. So that aspect of Koved Shabbos you physically fulfill.
Right.
But when the chulent is made, your wife made the chulent, and so there's Oineg Shabbos. I think Oineg Shabbos is enjoyment of Shabbos. You've participated, there's been Oineg Shabbos in the house. I think who fulfills it? It's a good question. So just like our women light the candles, so they're baking the challah too. It's included in the mitzvah of Koved Shabbos. Let's see the lashon of the Ramah. Nohagim lolosh kedei shir challah b'boyis. You have to make a certain amount of dough so that there's enough shir challah. Lasos me'am lechamim livtzo aleim b'Shabbos v'Yom Tov. In order to have loaves to make lechem mishnah on both Shabbos and Yom Tov. V'hu mikoved Shabbos v'Yom Tov. It's part of honoring Shabbos and Yom Tov. Ve'ein l'shanos. The source of the Ramah is the Darkei Moshe. Now remember, gentlemen, the Ramah is Rav Moshe Isserlis. And one of the Svarim the Ramah wrote many Sforim. One of the Sforim he wrote was the Darkei Moshe. The Ramah is based on the Darkei Moshe, which was a halachic sefer that Rav Moshe Isserlis wrote. So it's his own source. So he cites it, he brings in the Darkei Moshe as being from the Mordechai, that it is found at the end of the commentary of the Ran in certain Masachtas. Rav Isserlis writes that it seems from the Mordechai that it should be practiced only on Erev Yontif, but it's not necessary on Erev Shabbos. Rather, he explains the custom to make chal on Friday comes from the enactment of Ezra mentioned in the Gemara in Baba Kama that women should arise early on Friday and bake for Shabbos. Though in our versions of the Gemara, it does not specify Friday. So we see that there's a little debate whether this minhag was only before Yontif, but when the Ramah eventually brought the halacha, he brought it for both Shabbos and Yontif. Now, the Bir halacha, right? The Bir halacha was the Chafetz Chaim, along with the Mishnah Berurah. You'll see the Bir halacha are very detailed comments that the Chafetz Chaim himself wrote, where he mentions something in Mishnah Berurah where he elaborates in great detail on in the Bir halacha. So he comments that this custom of women baking challah Erev Shabbos is alluded to in a pasuk. And the women that do not practice it are not acting properly. It says, V'humi kavod Shabbos. V'yesh lezeh remez b'kasuv. It says in Shmos, right after Shiras Hayam, V'haya bayom hashishi, v'hechinu et asher yaviyu. Right? On Friday, they prepared. Et asher tofu efu. That which they had to bake, they baked. Mashma, therefore comes out the yesh le'efos be'erev Shabbos, lachin l'Shabbos. Seems like even from the pasuk, it seems that the women baked Erev Shabbos to prepare for Shabbos. Gam b'zman Gemara yamina kavua lezeh. This was a custom in the time of the Gemara. K'mo she'evia Mogen Avram. Uva avnosenu ha'rabim hayom, right? Because he's bemoaning our current state. Hitchilu ezu noshim lahashbis haminhag. Certain women stopped doing this custom. The loichim and oifen, they go to Schwartz's bakery. The lav shapir avdi, the maktinin b'zeh kavod Shabbos. Now, not everybody's going to agree with this Bir halacha. The Yakut Yosef agrees with the Bir halacha with regard to this issue, but the Orlet Sion, who is the Rabben Sion Abba Shaul, who was a contemporary of Rav Ovadia, disagrees. In his opinion, the fact that even the bakeries and supermarkets sell challah that is baked specially for Shabbos, that fulfills the custom. And there's no need to bake challah at home, right? If you go into Schwartz's bakery on Tuesday, you don't see geflochene challahs. You see them on Friday. Or you see them Erev Yontif. So you see clearly even the bakeries are baking it special for Shabbos. And therefore, if a woman goes in and especially purchase those challahs for Shabbos, according to the Orlet Sion, you fulfill the mitzvah. The Bir halacha, right? And he quotes this Bir halacha. Kara Tagar, the Mishnah Berurah complained or found fault. That's called Kara Tagar. Ala noshim she'enan oifas l'kavod Shabbos. On women who don't bake their own challahs on Shabbos. Ela loichos min ha'oifa, they buy from the bakery. Ubaktinus b'zeh kavod Shabbos, and the Bir halacha thought that there was a diminution of kavod Shabbos in that action. Ach nira, Hainu dafka bizmanam, shahayu lochim min ha'oifa lechem ragil. He says that was the time of the Chafetz Chaim when they would purchase regular bread from the baker. Ach bizmanenu sheyesh chalos miyuchados l'Shabbos, af b'mafiois. But today, in our bakeries, there are special chalos for Shabbos. Vehein me'ulot, and they're beautiful, b'tivan of the taman, in their taste and in their quality. Shaper yesh b'zeh kovet Shabbos. Vein tzarech lefos chalos b'bayis. I encourage you to read the biography of Rabbi Shaul. Rabbi Shaul, very often you will find he will argue with Rav Ovadia on certain halachas. It's a special merit for a woman who's expecting a child to separate challah, which is alluded to in the following Mishnah in Shabbos. Al sholosh averos noshim mesos b'shas lidason. Women die in childbirth for 3 averos. Al she'enon zehiros b'nida, b'chala, b'hadlakasa. Okay. So now we're going to go into more and more detail. What are the considerations for Hafrashas Challah? Which dough is subject to the obligation of Challah? I mean, there's a lot of baked goods. What dough requires Hafrashas Challah? We will now begin to examine the conditions under which the mitzvah of Hafrashas Challah applies, when it does not apply. The first, most basic principle is that it applies only to dough made from the 5 grains, as spelled out in the Mishnah in Challah. Chamisha dvorim chayovim b'challah. Chitim, so'orim, kusmin, shibol, shuol, shifon. Ari elu chayovim b'challah. Wheat, right, that's chita. So'orim is barley. Kusmin is spelt. Shibol, shuol is oats. And shifon is rye. According to the Gemara in Menachos, that is derived from the fact that the Torah used the word lechem within the context of challah. And the same word lechem is used in the context of matzah, where it refers to the 5 grains. It says in Masechta Menachos, Daf Ayin on the days, Hani in. It means the 5 grains you can make matzah out of. But oiris v'doichen lo. But rice and millet are not grains that ferment to be considered bread. Now, how do you know this? Not immediately. Amrish Lakish, Asya lechem lechem imatzah. Ksiva chavayabach lechem lechem haaretz. When you come to eat bread, which is the laws of challah, the ksiv hasam lechem oni, right? Which is matzah. Either it's poor man bread or lechem she'oinin aleim dvorim harbe. We speak over the matzah because we say magid. So it's called lechem. V'hasam gufim inolon. So how do you know lechem oni has to be made from the 5 grains? Amar Shlakish v'chein tanav Rabbi Shmuel v'chein tanav Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov. Amar Kra lo sochal alav chametz shiva samim tochal alav matzos lechem oni. So you see, there's this very famous hekesh between chametz and matzot in the same pasuk, so you can make a hekesh. So dvar mabam l'dei chimutz. So only those grains that will ferment through, rising, when you add yeast and it undergoes leavening. So we don't have rice matzah or millet matzah, but you do. If you go to the market, you'll see spelt matzah and oat matzah, and you have different kinds of matzahs made of the other grains, because they fulfill the chimutz. Rice and millet, they sort of deteriorate, or they decay, they rot, they don't ferment, or they don't leaven. And this is the ruling of the Shulchan Aruch. Ein chayv b'chala ela chameshes minei tevua. So right now we say that the 5 grains, at a minimum, it has to be the 5 grains. So what about the liquid in which the flour is needed? Flour that is baked with water is certainly subject to the mitzvah of Rosh Challah. What is the halacha, though, concerning flour that is needed with other liquids, such as milk, fruit juice? Right. The first principle that is relevant to this question is that there are 7 types of liquids that are generally considered halakhically significant with regard to many issues: wine, honey, oil, blood, milk, dew, water. The abbreviation is Yad Shachat Dam. The letters represent the first Hebrew letter of each of the liquids. So for example, we know there's a concept of Hechsher L'Kabel Tuma. If a dead sheretz falls on some grain, right? If the grain is dry, then it's not Makabel Tuma. You need fluid has to moisten a dry food in order for it to be Makabel Tuma. So these 7 liquids are the liquids that can be machshir something to be Makabel Tuma. So what is the halacha with respect to fruit juice that's not included in the list? The Mishnah Chala states that fruit juice is still included, and challah must be taken from dough that was kneaded with fruit juice. Isa shenilusha b'mei peros chayeves b'challah. The Rambam rules in accordance with this Mishnah, the Mishnah Torah. Over the Rosh is uncertain whether this should be the accepted halacha, and therefore both opinions are brought by the Tur. Remember, the Tur's father was the Rosh, and the Tur would use a combination of the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rosh. He would usually, he would 2 against 1. The Tur would usually paskin 2 against 1 if they were not in agreement between those 3 earlier codifiers of halacha. So the Tur wrote, Isa shenilusha b'mei beitzim. Let's say a dough, you had put eggs in the dough, o biyayin, wine, o dvash, below shumayim, without any water. Because of a Rambam shechayeves b'chala. Va'adoni avizal, right? This is Yaakov ben Arosh speaking, Yaakov Balaturim, the author of the Tur, referencing his father, the Rosh. Hayam Istapik, the Rosh lived in Toledo. Hayam Istapik b'dover, because of Tovizar, Shalololush Isha b'mei beitzim levadan, below Taruvas Mayim, k'dei lotus b'dei sfeika. So he suggested, put some water in there to make sure that it's not safek whether it's chayav chala or not. By adding water, it's going to be certainly chayav chala, and because he's uncertain if it's only has one of these liquids without any water, it's a suffix whether challah would be needed. Right? The Beis Yosef explains that the reason the Rosh was unsure whether to accept the Mishnah as the halacha is because it states in the Talmud Yerushalmi that Rabbi Akiva disagrees with the Mishnah. Right? Says that, we brought a Befershtika Mishnah in Challah. Isa shenilusha b'mei peres chayeves b'challah. So how could the Rosh argue with a Befershtika Mishnah? Says the Beis Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, right, in his commentary on the Tur, Harosh Kosev B'Hilchos Chala, the Itmar B'Yerushalmi, on Rav Yosef Bar Chanina, Rav Elazar Ish Bar Tuta, Nira, the Afal Gav, the Sosam Lon Rebbe, even though Rebbe wrote an anonymous Mishnah, that's a stam, that's what it means, Sosam Lon Rebbe. He gave us an unnamed Mishnah. The Isa Shiniloshim may Peres Chayav B'Chala, that dough that was kneaded with fruit juice was Chayav B'Chala, but Kivan da Amaroi Savri de Mei Peros Ein Mechabim L'Chala, but later Amoiroi held that fruit juice was not appropriate for Chala, Umukbing Hachstam Krablos Ben Yehuda Ish Bar Tuta. And we identified that who was the author of that unnamed Mishnah? It was Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yehuda, Upolig Ale Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Kiva argues with him. The Kaimilon, and there is a rule. How do you paskin when there's certain tanoim against other tanoim? So in Erevin in Memvav, which we had in the Daf Yomi not too long ago, that whenever there's a machlokas Rabbi Kiva mechavero, we paskin like Rabbi Kiva. In Kain, in Alocha Kastam Mishnah Zu. So there's a real lomdus reason why the Rosh didn't follow that Mishnah and was mesupik, was in doubt what to do regarding challah, that if the dough was made with fruit juice. So the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with the Rambam that dough made with fruit juice is subject to the mitzvah of hafrashas challah. The Shulchan Aruch in Yoreh says, "Isa shinilshu mei peros afilu below shumayim chayaves b'challah." The Shach, though, does mention the uncertainty of the Rosh, and consequently rules that one should separate challah without a bracha, or separate challah for it from other dough that is definitely obligated. Says the Shach, chayaves varosh poter, v'chein Bartanura mistapik, but the Bartanura, who was a comment on the Mishnah, was mesupik. Lachen yesh lafrish below bracha. We're going to see in a minute that even in Chutz La'aretz a bracha is made if you make a certain amount of dough and separate challah based on that. But in this case, you should eat mafresh without a bracha. Oh, im yesh lo isa shelo worma, or if you have a dough that you still haven't taken challah from, yaniach isa zu shenilusha b'mei peiros. Set aside the dough that you did with the fruit juice next to the other dough. Eitzel isa shelo worma chalasa, v'yafresh challah mi isa shelo worma chalasa, and then take challah from the dough that was mechuyev challah. Gam al zu shenilusha b'mei peiros. Okay. We're in the middle here, but we'll stop here and continue on this very important issue of what kind of challah do you need to separate, and how much of dough do you need, and how do you do it? So we have some interesting halachas going forward.
So why do we say you make a bracha if it's suffix? It's one's a deraisa, one's a rabbanan. They can make the chachamim can make something that you make a bracha.
Yes, Elazar. For example, Mikra Megillah. It says Asher Kiddishanu Mitzvah Tzivanu Al Mikra Megillah. So the Gemara asks, Heichan Savinu. How can we make a bracha Asher Kiddishanu? So the Gemara there says Lo Sasur. Right? We are commanded to listen to the Chachamim. Lo Sasur Yaminu Small. So most poskim hold that for example, when we make a bracha on Daled Koisois, it's also rabbinic. Or we make tonight's bracha, lahadlik ner shel Chanukah. You're making a bracha on a rabbinic mitzvah. How can you do that? So the Chachamim have the ability to allow us to make brachas on mitzvahs that they tell us to make.
Obviously, I should have thought about them before.
No, but that's a good question.
Yeah.
In fact, the Gemara asks that question. Echan Sivanu. So it gives us a number of answers, but the final opinion there is Lo Sasur. Echan Sivanu from Lo Sasur. Any other comments or aros or?
Again, what about bracha achrita as far as the I think other than the 5 types of grain, do we have? We don't make emotzi, obviously, right? You make mazonos. Is that right?
Correct.
So
That's a big discussion of what you do after rice. Some say burn it,
right.
some say it's considered mazon. That's when we get to Hilchos Brachos. Mirz Hashem, we're going to have Mirz Hashem. The Tzurba will have a long discussion on that.
All right.
sure.
Okay.